Other thing, yeah. Hopefully tonight's won't be too wonky. Since I'm at home and I don't have my usual setup that kind of makes my life easier. And really a lot of what we're doing tonight, I'm hoping can revolve around some discussion of the assignment that we had. The assignment was, of course, to pray. So hopefully that wasn't too taxing. Um, the plan for the evening. We're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to kind of carry over our conversation from last week on Episcopal structure and polity, and talk a little bit about that in light of General Convention, and then also in light of Thomas Cranmer's introduction to the 1549 prayer book, which hopefully everyone had a chance to read. I had also invited Wendy to share her reflections. I'm not sure if she's up to that because I haven't touched base with her since then. So we may have a moment of that or we may not, and Wendy, either one is fine. And then we'll talk about our prayer assignment a little bit, and then kind of finish up with our Book of Common Prayer. Something in that neighborhood. So last week, well, I'm going to introduce this a little bit, and then we'll see where we kind of are with things. Last week, the Episcopal Church met 808 some odd delegates, 820, 30 people. The numbers vary, and about 106 bishops. Showed up in Louisville, Kentucky for the 81st General Convention. The convention tends to meet every 3 years, except when they're modified by COVID. So it kind of gives a sense of how long this has been going on for, since I believe 1781. Which would have been the first convention of the Episcopal Church, when they're trying to establish who they are as a separate body from the Church of England. And we spent the week. The General Convention is a legislative body, which means that it's there to propose and approve or disapprove legislative measures that change the structure of the church, affirm the structure of the church, point the church in new directions, that do all manner of things. I don't know, how many people have been to convention? I guess just a show of hands, or so. Quite a few. Yes, Wendeth, very, very pleased to have gone, no doubt, at this point. So we want to talk about what convention does and kind of relate that back a little bit to our local contexts. So the first question we have is this. The church functions by passing resolutions. I was going to wait and do this a little bit later, but this is a good one to show you. So let me see if I can turn this on without messing up the rest of my life. I can't. That's terrible. Okay. Well, shoot. Okay. Well, let me turn it on in a way that does mess up my life. Let me share my screen here briefly. Like I said, prepare yourself for this. At home, I've got like 2 big screens and everything. I can just put stuff different places, and you've got all these wonderful options. And right now, I really don't. Oh, actually, that's exactly what I want. So we'll share this. So you should see something on your screen. A095, continue the task force on Indigenous liturgy. We're going to come back and talk about this in some detail a little bit later. But the resolution is this: resolved that the Episcopal Church acknowledge that Indigenous people have been a part of the Episcopal Church since Jamestown in 1607, that the Church has labeled Indigenous ways pagan and forced Indigenous people to abandon traditional ways and languages, and Be it further resolved that the work of the Task Force on Indigenous Liturgy, established by a separate resolution in 2022, continue its work through the 2025-2027 triennium and be funded to continue that work, to meet in both healing talking circles and by Zoom, to listen deeply, share profoundly, and continue the process of being integrated with the context, language, and identity of the Episcopal Church. So that's the resolution that's being proposed. And I wonder if we could respond to that a little bit by asking this: what is it that these resolutions do? I mean, this kind of has to be prior knowledge. So, we just read one together. But for those of you that have been part of this before, what are we trying to do when we use these tools to shape our life?
This is Marion. Mm-hmm. We're trying to bring this, well, it's the whole idea of our responsibility in the church, to the church, for the church, to the whole church. That's one of the things that it does. And it's very important in the beginning. And then to go forward with study, reflection, and suggestions on how that might be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone have anything else to add or contribute to that?
Well, I would, just having seen this for the first time tonight, I would hope that the backdrop to this is to allow Native communities to become acculturated to the Episcopal Church and vice versa, so that we don't look upon Native customs and traditions as something strange, exotic, primitive, out of place, so that there can be a melding or a merging of cultures within the Episcopal Church. In other words, the Episcopal Church is to be viewed as a broad tent, a big tent, and it can encompass other cultures, particularly Native cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to come back to that exact point here in a little bit. So put a pin in that, because that's a big part of what's happening right now in the church. Anyone else have anything they want to kind of share about that, or what's happening in these resolutions?
Marion, I feel from visiting Navajo land and the tribes in the Dakotas that we have given lip service to this for over a century. And finally, in this convention, we have made Navajo land a diocese, which has given it status not as a missionary diocese. And we have, in the beginning, absolutely kind of devastated the Navajo religious practices and other religious practices of Native peoples to adhere to our own. And for the past 25, 30 years have been trying to rectify that. Mm-hmm. So I think that was quite a feat. I was there right after the first Navajo person was ordained to the priesthood, and now there are several Navajo priests in Navajo land. But So it's been a long journey, and one that is coming to fruition with the making Navajo land a diocese rather than a missionary district.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So one of the things that happened at this convention was
Sorry.
oh, you're right. The missionary district of Navajo land, which encompasses land, I think, around the Arizona, New Mexico border and environs, was made into a missionary diocese. And the distinction between those two things, as a mission area or whatever it was technically called before, what that meant was that it was the responsibility of the national church to provide leadership, to appoint a bishop, to do things for Navajo land. As a missionary diocese, they have the right to call their own bishop, to organize themselves in the way they see fit, to abandon the name Navajo land, which sounds like something that may happen fairly quickly, so that they can adopt an appropriate name in their language. And then what goes along with that, once you have a sovereign nation that has its own diocese, its own leadership, its own language, its own structure, is you want it to have its ability to worship within that context. And so that's part of what this particular resolution that we're looking at. And Nancy, I see your hand up. I'll catch you in just a second. That's part of what this is a piece of. What I want to call your attention to here at the outset is that this is a way for the church to do work. And it's a way for it to do work across time. The context of this resolution goes from 1607 to 2024. So it's a resolution that's over 400 years in the making, that acknowledges the poor ways that we have treated people in the past, although I will note that it stops short of language about repentance for this behavior, that kind of language. But then the other thing that it does, so it contextualizes this work over this 400-year period of time when the church has caused material, spiritual, physical, and emotional harm to these peoples. And what we're doing is we're continuing a task force that was already established and created 2 years ago. We are setting time limits on that, and we are funding it. That means we're telling the national church, the body that exists in New York City at the headquarters, and that establishes budgets and funding and things like that. We want $300,000 to go to this, and we want that money to do certain things. And this is, like I said, part of what I wanted to do tonight was talk about this, because it's part of the idea of this class to connect our spirituality and ethos to our polity, and to connect the national to the local. And so part of what that does is that has implications for our own diocese, for the work that we're doing amongst the 5 tribes that are within our area, the conversations that we're having with them, and what's going on. And so that's what the resolutions do. They establish work. They can modify the canons or the Constitution. Or they may just be statements of position. This tells you a sense of what it is that we think about things. So we also looked at resolutions that described opposition to the war in Gaza, how it was being waged, things that oppose certain harmful practices, white nationalism, harmful practices in aid that is given to people in need, and things like that. We also talked about things that are aspirational. So some of the resolutions had to do with reparations, that nobody's actually going to be paying out or doing anything anytime soon, or how we handle our healthcare obligations. But they're resolutions that describe where our thinking is now as we're moving towards those pieces. So that's what is happening in that piece of it. Nancy, did you have something that you wanted to say? And I apologize for leaving you hanging there for a bit.
That's okay. I just was thinking that hasn't the Anglican Church done this with the New Zealand prayer book, where we've incorporated a native culture and combined them, and yet we seem to struggle so hard with how to do this with the Native Americans that we know.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The New Zealand Prayer Book, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, is a book that's written in two different languages. So one is the language of the Maori people, and the prayers in that are reflective of their understanding and their theology. And probably the easiest place to see this is in, let me see if I can type this in real quick. Is in the Lord's Prayer, which I think is really wonderful, and not everybody does. But it's really a delightful prayer, and I just found it. Here we go. That reflects Maori understandings, and so it goes like this. It's written in English, so it's one of these, but it reflects the Maori understanding. Eternal Spirit, Earth Maker, Pain Bearer, Life Giver, source of all that is and all that shall be, Father and Mother of us all, loving God, in whom is heaven. The hallowing of your name echo through the universe. The way of your justice be followed by the peoples of the world. Your heavenly will be done by all created beings. Your commonwealth of peace and freedom sustain our hope and come on earth. With the bread we need for today, feed us. In the hurts we absorbed from one another, forgive us. In times of temptation and test, strengthen us. From trials too great to endure, spare us. From the grip of all that is evil, free us. For you reign in the glory of the power that is love, now and forever. Amen. What a wonderful expression of Christian faith and doctrine that comes through ideas and understandings of another people and that we get access to. That it's one of the things that happens when we allow our liturgy and our faith to come in contact with the faith of other peoples and to be shaped and informed by that. And however we do that, it's designed to bring about a greater expression of what it means to be the body of Christ in its fullness. And what we're going to see tonight is that meaning has expanded beyond simply everybody has one book of common prayer written in English, and that's what you need to follow. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going. The next question I want to ask is this, and then I want to pick up something from last week. And I know we don't meet every week, but it's easier for me to say last week than whenever it was that we just met, because I have no actual recollection of when that was, which has something to do with the fact that I spent a week in a windowless room with 800 COVID-infected people. Okay. So the next question is this. Part of the thing with the resolutions is that they can and do change and modify the canons of this church. So I think I've sent you a copy of the Constitution and canons. You were able to look at that a week ago. So when we talk about a canon, what are we talking about? What is a canon and what does it do? And so again, it's going to be prior knowledge. It can come from your reading previously, what we did last week, what were our experience, whatever.
Well, this can get a bit murky, I think, Brad, because depending on the usage of the term canon, its intent, and I think at least one intention is to provide guidance. Some people interpret it as law.
Mm-hmm.
And the continuum in between.
Yeah.
So,
And it has both of those characteristics. There are certain things where it very much functions as a law. I'm going to give an example of that in a moment. And then there are many other things where it functions primarily in terms of guidance. Like the word canon itself comes from the Greek word, which is basically canon. But in Greek, it was referring to a straight, like a measuring rod or a standard by which something is judged or evaluated. And so we use this word within the church. We refer to the canon of Scripture. And so that means that we have a list of books by which we measure who we are, how our faith is shaped, how we speak about ourselves. We do it in our structures. We have someone in a diocese is called the canon to the ordinary. That is, it's their role to maintain the standards within that diocese in support of the bishop. The bishop is supposed to be, sort of the chief pastor of the diocese. So we don't want her spending all of her time looking up rules and regulations and trying to figure out if we're adhering to this. We have somebody else that we've charged with doing that. And then we have canons within our that we've established for ourselves. This is what it means to be part of this church. And in many cases, they are very much guidelines. I think we talked about that last week with the ordination requirements. It's a guideline that gives a lot of latitude to individual dioceses to figure out how they're going to shape this. We're going to talk about another canon here in a minute that gives very, very little ability for a diocese to change how they shape it. So are there other reflections on canon or something that someone wants to kind of mention in their experience with it or their understanding of it before I talk about the kind of the canon I want to talk about a little? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on. So here's what I want to talk about a little bit with this tonight. What the canons do is they establish church governance as something that belongs simply to the church. It's separate from state governance, and it'd be separate from the governance of other ecclesial bodies, other Christian church bodies. And it has this canon law title because the practice of law develops both within the church and within secular institutions sort of parallel to each other. So one is sort of in imitation of the other. You can't say that one came directly from the other or vice versa, anything like that. It just means that there's a related understanding for how these things function and shape how we carry ourselves, how we conduct ourselves. And so the first thing that you would see if you flip open that PDF that I sent with the canons and Constitution, we'll come back to the Constitution at the end. So we're kind of doing this backwards, I guess, but that seems to fit the evening. So if you go to the index of those canons, what you'll see is there are 5 sections of canons. The first one has to do with how we organize ourselves. So it talks about, dioceses and clergy people and building, just stuff that exists out there that says these are things that we have. We use them for our betterment and to help people in the world. This is how we relate to them as a body. The next thing talks about how we worship. So it's going to include a lot of stuff on our liturgy, on the prayer book, on any number of issues related to worship. Then how we minister, how we conduct ourselves for mission. And then the one that we're going to talk about tonight is how we discipline ourselves, what we do when somebody misbehaves, particularly somebody who's a member of clergy. And then the fifth one is how we change ourselves. So it provides ways for us to modify what it means to be Episcopalian, what it means to hold these laws and rules, guidelines, whatever you want to call them, how we can adapt ourselves to changing circumstances and changing realities. So the canons I want to talk about tonight are in the Title IV process. And the reason I'm doing this is because the last time we met, we ended with a discussion about how the structure of the Episcopal Church was really designed to leave decision-making at as local a level as possible. And the example I gave reflected that, and it talked about all the latitude that we have to fulfill some of these canon guidelines. And as soon as the Zoom call ended, I thought of another important example that if it's not a counterexample, it's at least an example where as local as possible is very, very intentionally not local. As local as possible in the case of our disciplinary canons has to do, it sits at the diocesan, at the regional, or at the national level. And there's a reason for that. Basically, the Title IV canons, without getting into everything that could catch somebody up, are there to discipline primarily clergy who have abused their office or have been accused of abusing their office because they have protections in this system as well. But for clergy that have behaved poorly through say sexual misconduct, through drug and alcohol addictions that become problematic, that spill over into the workplace, financial misconduct, abusive behavior that's directed towards parishioners or other people around them. You can be charged and tried based on those things. And the part that I want to kind of highlight tonight is this. The disciplinary board. What happens is in a Title IV inquiry, and that's what it is. It's first of all an information gathering thing, and it's something that that everybody has protectors, people to speak for them, to help them to navigate the process, and to provide as positive an outcome as possible. The disciplinary board is purposefully designed to provide regional and national oversight. You cannot discipline somebody from within a local context in the Episcopal Church. And the reason for that is this. I'm going to tell you a little bit about part of my background. I've mentioned this before. I was ordained in another denomination that was fiercely congregational, that had nothing even remotely close to something like a canon and constitution and a general convention where everybody got together and talked about what needed to be done. Aside from a few key elements of faith and worship, which were important, the single biggest reason that I left that denomination and came into the Episcopal Church is because I do not have enough fingers and toes to count all of the clergy members that I knew in the old denominational system who would have been implicated in Title IV proceedings if such a thing existed. There are really two things that happen in systems that don't have regional oversight for issues like this. The first one is you show up to your pastor and you say, your clergy person, and you say, hey, I couldn't help but notice that there's $20,000 missing from the account. What happened to it? And he says, oh, I got a really good deal on this $50,000 stereo, but I could buy it for $20,000. So I didn't think the church would mind if I took it out of the treasury, right? I'm awful sorry, but that's what I did, And maybe there's some extenuating circumstances, and everybody gets together and they say, well, gee, he is sorry now. Now that he's caught, he's sorry. So we're going to keep it in-house, right? And this is something that is particularly prevalent with sexual misconduct because of the way that impacts both the perpetrator and the victim. So there's been an article in the news for the past few weeks about this megachurch pastor in Texas who finally, and he's probably like 50 something, who finally acknowledged some inappropriate relations with what he referred to as a young lady. I had inappropriate relations with this young lady. It happened 20 years ago, right? It's something that's in the past. Nothing like that's happened since. Oh, well, he's really sorry. You know, he stepped out of ministry, he did the work. And then the story, the news article was about was this person that he's calling a young lady was at the time of the abuse a 12-year-old, right? So it's something that it was kept in house. It wasn't known. It wasn't published. It wasn't something that anybody could find about this person, or it was something that could be dismissed by saying it was an inappropriate relationship with a young lady, and that hasn't happened since. I was young. It was a long time ago. That sounds radically different than actually having like a cop, knowing what happened, which is what happens in the Episcopal Church. You know what happened. That kind of stuff can't get swept away and swept under the rug, or if it does, there's a mechanism to do it. I don't know how to do it, which I'm just as happy about. The other thing that happens in those kind of situations is a person gets caught and is disciplined by the church, by the congregational body. And in response, they just go to the church down the road. That happened at the church I grew up in. They hired a minister who'd been involved in multiple affairs at his previous church. And I know that for a fact because I knew one of the people who was on staff there. And there'd been rumors about this at previous churches. So it's a serial behavior. And what happens is the decision for discipline at the congregational level tends to be informal and relational. So this guy's looking for work. And so everybody knows, because you know stuff like that. You hear the rumors, you know what's going on. And so what happens is they call the other minister, the board chairman from the church down the road, and they say, oh, what happened? And they say, well, this is what we know, and he's not here anymore. And then he gets hired somewhere else where he repeats that behavior again. So the canons in the Episcopal Church are designed to be both local and then protective. So there's a give and take to them with the kind of oversight that they offer and how they function. Like you see, there's different levels of protection that are taking place in these two examples. So the one we gave last week that was really designed to protect local autonomy. And then the one that we're talking about this week, even if the one we talked about last week, in regard to the ordination project, it doesn't always protect that local autonomy. The one that I wanted to highlight this week is one that doesn't allow much local autonomy, precisely because it's not safe to do that. So the canons function in those different ways for different circumstances, and they're carefully argued about and designed to do that. Okay. Having said that, let's turn to, I wanted to give a chance to talk about General Convention a little bit. Wendith, did you have a chance to prepare anything? And it's completely understandable if you don't. Katie, you were there as well. So if either of you have any reflections that you would like to share, or if anybody actually tuned in and watched some of that, God bless you, first of all. But does anyone have anything that they'd like to share, reflections from convention?
Well, I will jump in. I don't know how prepared I am, but I sat and scribbled notes as we went along. It was interesting for me because I work for the federal government, and so I am familiar with the secular way of making rules and things in the country where we live. And so this was very interesting to see how this two-house way of making decisions, this parliamentary procedure, is adapted to church work. I don't know, there are a lot of people who've been there many, many years in a row and call themselves church nerds. They're incredibly knowledgeable about how the sausage is made and how this process goes on. But to me, the the most interesting part was listening to conversation, and not really conversation, but debate about these resolutions, coming from two places, some of them coming from this is right and good so to do, this thing being proposed, and then people speaking against it, not necessarily saying this is not right, it's just not this way. Maybe this is not the best way to go about this. And having that conversation is kind of hard because there were some reactionary moments there where people were civil and there wasn't any, open brawling, which would have been, I don't know. It wasn't the British Parliament, we'll put it that way. But there were some moments where people were really working hard to try and see and understand each other, or not, or out debate each other, with 2-minute sermons, for and against, each with biblical either quotations or references that, I don't know, seem to be buying credibility, right, for that side of the argument. It was interesting, and interesting to feel the balance between the House of Deputies and the House of Bishops in things like, in this resolution, are we going to use the word apartheid when we're talking about the Middle East? Are we going to use genocide? Or are we going to use the words that are part of the definitions of those words if you look them up, but not the words themselves? And it's very interesting to watch the reaction going back and forth. I think other bishops and other dioceses are maybe more, and maybe I'm just blind to what's happening in our own space, but they seem, there's more politics at play for some of them, and different local church expressions of Anglicanism and the Episcopalian way of being, to the point where it's not easy for them to use words like that. So when it got into those hard areas, the votes were broken into lay and ordained, so that bishops could see that their ordained people were falling in line behind them, or not. It was very, very interesting. And I mean, there were all kinds of things that happened there. I was fascinated by the different levels of change. There are lots of good systems in place to keep the church from radically lurching in one direction or another, by having some things have to be approved, some major changes approved 3 different conventions. That's a little frustrating for some people, I'm sure, but also keeps us from doing anything too weird quickly. I don't know. I was quite frankly gobsmacked that no one stood up and spoke and cheered, that in my heart, that no one stood up and spoke against the change in the catechism, for holy matrimony, from the words the man and the woman to 2 people. It was a great moment there, and I think the moment for Navajo land, which was pretty amazing, was pretty cool to be there for too. So it was good to be there when we were doing good things. It was frustrating to be there when we were debating how many angels should stand on one side of the head of a pin and how many should stand on the other. It was like, oh, come on. But anyway, that's I have a whole lot of notes, but that's as far as I'm gonna get before my throat gives out here.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Wendy. Katie, do you have anything that you want to contribute? Take that as a maybe not.
I
Oh, there
well,
we go.
just echo kind of what Wendy said about being able to hear the discussions. I think that convention is all on record, and so with that, that means no matter if things passed or didn't, we actually had conversations about it, and at least got to have people's voices heard, so that maybe this year things didn't pass, or maybe things did pass, but we got to talk about it really in depth. Whereas I attended the League of Women Voters National Convention and they did not leave time for that debate and discussion. It was like, we just gotta get through everything. And some things like, I was really happy that we are supporting the end gun violence stuff, and we're supporting the rights for marriage, and we did talk about the Middle East stuff, even though we didn't really make huge impactful decisions about it, because we can only say what we are, as our organization can do, and make resolutions in a government, or not like a government body, but a governing organization body. So it's not like, I know that a lot of people at the convention was like, what is this resolution going to do if we pass it? And it might not be an immediate action, but it is a stance, and it's on record. So those are really important things, I think. And it was my first time, so I was learning a lot as I went. And yeah, I really appreciated a lot of it, even though in the moment I was like, man, it's almost 6 o'clock. What are we doing? But yeah, it was great.
Yes. Thank you, Katie. I apologize for kind of putting you on the spot there. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it really was. It's very much all of those things combined in a week of, like I said, just sitting in a room with people and having a sense of where the church is and what people are concerned about and where they would like it to go. All right, I've got some more stuff that I want to talk about in relation to convention and our polity, our structure, and things like that. But before we do that, I want to go back to our exercise on prayer. And so hopefully everybody got that last week. Hopefully you've been able to kind of pray that daily as best you can. And maybe if you have that in front of you, this would be a good time to dig that out. So a couple of questions, because I wanted to have tonight be a little bit more conversational than some of our previous gatherings have been, because I think that that's part of what this is. And as has been noted, I mean, the way that we govern ourselves is conversational. When we gather at convention, it's so we can talk with one another. And when we learn, we want to be able to talk with one another. The first thing, I guess, is just broadly speaking, what was your experience with this exercise? This isn't really a standard prayer that you would find anywhere in the prayer book. It's kind of cobbled together from several different places. Though it relies on prayer book prayers and origins and stuff. So what was everyone's experience with this?
I had a good experience with it. I tried to either read from these prayers that you sent out, or I have a little set of prayers that I have on some note cards that I try to look at in the morning. And the problem I have is that contemplation, I'll pick out some words and start thinking about them. And all of a sudden I find myself wandering quite a bit. That's something I'm trying to work on, to focus and just actually accomplish something by reading and studying.
Thank you, Tom. I'll mention something on that note that you ended with. This is a good devotional practice that has been developed through kind of, what we did really it was a form of Lectio Divina, if you're familiar with that, where you read, pray, meditate, and contemplate. And the practice within that is, as these other ideas or these other maybe unwanted thoughts, because we're here to pray and then we're thinking about, after I get done with this, I really need to go mow the lawn. One way to deal with this that I found helpful and that I've seen written down in numerous books is to simply thank God for offering that thought to you and for calling that to mind, and then returning the thought back to God as you return yourself to prayer. It's not a perfect system, but it is a way of addressing that, and then maybe helping yourself to leave that so that you can focus on the prayers. And I'm mentioning that not because that's directed at you and your experience, but because I found that well, I'm here on my farm. We had spiritual retreats for 20 years, and so this is what we did with people. And I've talked to an awful lot of people that have had that difficulty. And so that's one thing that you can do to help. That's just free. That's not really part of the lesson, but it may be a useful piece for people in our prayer life as we carry on. What other experiences that folks had, or reflections on the exercise as a whole?
Brad, I'll say that I honestly did not have the time that I wanted to take to work on this piece right now, so I can go back and reread things. But I had a very intense conversation with a young person who's really struggling with anxiety to the point where it's debilitating.
Mm-hmm.
And that young person is trying to find a church that they are comfortable in. And so doing a little searching here and there. And so we just had a conversation about, that those issues and how prayer helps or can help. And so that was quite enlightening for me.
Mm.
And so we'll see. We'll see where this leads, but at least that person knows that they're not walking this alone.
Mm-hmm.
They acknowledge that they knew they were never alone, but it can certainly feel that way when you're so anxious about everything that you can hardly function. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you.
mhm.
Any other experiences that you want to share? How many people did this? I guess that would be one question. We'll find out what the hope is for our conversation here. Okay. So you guys will have to carry this a little bit. And if you didn't get a chance to do it this time, then, maybe try to do it between now and next week and see how it sits in light of the conversation. Anyone else like to share?
Well, I appreciated can you all hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I appreciated the fact that it's a very condensed form of the traditional hours of daily prayer. So this could be used either in the morning or in the evening. It opens with a line from Isaiah, who happens to be one of the most profound and provocative of the prophets. And it gives you plenty to meditate on. And that's kind of an invitatory. And then it moves into the traditional opening, Lord, open my lips that my mouth may proclaim your praise. And Psalm 40 is a very powerful psalm that, to me, it strikes me as a description of the experience of redemption or atonement. It's amazing grace, and it's very ecstatic. And the Psalms are particularly important in daily prayer because it gives us the language for our feelings about God. And if you pray the Psalms daily, that language gets under your skin, and you can you can begin to sound like this in prayer without the aid of the Psalms, if you do it for many years.
Mhm.
The Teresa of Avila reading is also very powerful, and again comes from this ecstatic, mystical realm, concluding with her ecstatic request, let him kiss me with the kiss of his mouth, for without you, what am I, Lord? That's sort of the sort of ultimate statement that someone who is living a monastic existence can say. And then the collect sort of brings it all back together, because it pulls you back out of the ecstasy into the more formalistic language of the Anglican Church, and sort of orders your thoughts and brings you back to earth.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I want to come back and talk about that phrase that you uttered, it gets under your skin. But I'm going to do that in a minute because I want to give other people a chance to talk. Did anyone notice that your prayer changed over time? Part of the reason to have you do this daily for a week is it's a decent amount of time. It's not the most time you can spend praying one prayer. But to see how you experience prayer over time, because that's an important part of what it means to be Anglican. And so I wonder if anyone had noticed anything in that regard. Say the first day you did it, you said, oh, I really thought this and I liked that, or this really touched me. And then by the end of the week, there was something else that you were focusing on. Or several somethings kind of came together and offered you new insight.
I found that different words and phrases popped out as the week went on, and one day I would focus on one phrase, and then the next day something else would jump out at me.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any reflections on what that accomplished for you spiritually, or how did that shape how you prayed or how you thought about prayer?
Probably the main thing was to get me thinking about prayer, just seeing these phrases and then kind of meditating a little bit, but then continuing on with the prayer, and having that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And then during the day, when I would remember, I would try to, those would come back to me sometimes too.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
When I repeat things like this over and over, it's like walking down a trail that that you have experienced, but every time you go, there are the familiar things, the turns are in the same place, the psalm ends and goes on to the next thing, the mood changes that we just talked about happen, and the focus changes, but every time you go down that trail, there's some new turn of a leaf, there's some new way the light shines, there's some new way of experiencing it that's shaped by either the experience that that I'm anticipating for the day, or the one I had the day before, or what I had for breakfast. I don't know what excuse me, but it to me it's like a trail that is new every time.
Mm-hmm.
I started a new prayer practice on Pentecost. And one of the things that I wanted to add to my prayer discipline was reading scripture in an organized way for me. And I found that after doing this practice that I set for myself, which was invitatory and etc. And then, closing after the meditation on the scripture, was that when it came time after a couple of weeks, when it came time to go to bed, when I finished with everything and I would just lie down and close my book or whatever I was doing, names or situations would come into my mind. And it was after I read the selections that you gave us, it was interesting to me how it was like God speaking to me with a purpose or a person who I should pray for or who needed my prayer.
Mm.
And that I didn't know a specific thing to pray for. And so I couldn't ask for things, which got me into that kind of praying for people in situations that I have been asked to pray for. Is just to open myself to God and open my prayer to ask that those situations be open to God. And that was a new kind of experience for me.
That's lovely. Thank you for sharing that. Well, anyone else want to share any of their experience with this? Yeah, Blade, please.
So I'll talk about kind of the idea in general because I was very ill and didn't see this until Sunday. But in the tradition that I grew up in, which was I now realize was a very anti-Catholic ideology. They took the story in the New Testament about how Jesus said, don't pray repetitively, to mean like we don't follow those Catholic rubrics, the common prayer, blah blah blah. So when I came into the Episcopal Church, one of the things that did draw me to it was the Book of Common Prayer, was the liturgy, were things like this that you had many people. When it comes to the BCP, it's thousands of people across the country, across the globe, pretty much, using the same kind of prayers and rubrics. And I have a very dear friend who was a very devout Catholic, was a Catholic missionary for a while. And I was talking to him about it one day shortly after I joined, and I was like, I have never felt like a part of the big C church until I started going to a liturgical church, because it's not just a little C church. The congregation, because that was similar to what I grew up in, you had your local congregation and that was church.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I never felt like a part of the big C church until I started following rubrics like this, that I'm like, there are thousands of people using the same formula all over the country, if not beyond, at the same time that I am. And he's like, you get it now. It's like, I've been telling you this for a while, not to try and get you to become Catholic, but to explain why I like the missal and why I like liturgy. And he's like, and now you get it. It is so unifying to have these kind of rubrics for at least myself, who grew up in a tradition that was vehemently against any kind of rubrics. And so that's something that I still appreciate to this day.
Thank you for sharing that. And I can certainly confirm your experience. I was preaching a sermon at the church I grew up in. I'd come back from Bible college and I was sitting down beforehand and I was writing out, because you're supposed to pray at the end. And so I was writing my prayer out, because I think that prayer should be thought about at least occasionally. And the pastor shows up and he says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm writing my prayer." And it was that, this rote nonsense. You're just supposed to stand up and do it. And I said, "No, I'm thinking. Thank you. I can really identify with a lot of that. One of the things, and we're going to transition kind of back to our prayer book. Hopefully everyone had a chance to read the introduction to the 1549 prayer book, which I'm sure was exciting lunchtime reading for you or something. Kind of apologize for not getting it out until yesterday. Last week was kind of crazy. And it wasn't until yesterday I realized it would be a really good way to kind of encapsulate some stuff and draw it together. One of the things that I wanted to happen in this exercise, and I think each of you who spoke mentioned some component of this, is to see how these disparate parts, there's scripture here, there are traditional prayers, there's a reading from one of the kind of saints and mystics of the church. There's part of the psalm from the Book of Common Prayer. This is the Miles Coverdale sort of version, or whatever's in his lineage that's unique to the prayer book. One of the things that I wanted to see happen in this is to see how these disparate prayers, scriptures, psalms, readings, and understandings can fit together to form a relatively coherent whole. Part of that was by design, because I picked them out and I put them together. Part of that was a little bit fortuitous because I happened to have that St. Teresa reading available on my computer because I'd used it for spiritual retreats and things like that, and it fit well enough with the rest of it that it was a good addition since I didn't have my library handy. But one of the things that I want us to kind of note here, and this is my reading of this as I sat with this for the last week. I made an experiment to see if it was possible to pray during legislative meetings of General Convention. The answer is maybe. I don't know, sort of. I tried. I made the attempt. And here's a couple things that I noticed in this. Each of these prayers is designed, or I don't know if it's designed, but it's just the way that they come together. They establish relationships. They establish relationships between God and humanity. They establish relationships amongst peoples. And they establish relationships between the Godhead. Right? I dwell in the high and holy place, and also with the one who has a contrite and humble spirit. So we start off with this vision of God who dwells in multiple places, in the holiest places and with us. And one of the things that language like that does in our prayers is it begins to blur some lines and boundaries. If God dwells in the high and holy place, and God also dwells with the one who has a contrite and humble spirit, which may or may not be me. I'm not making that claim for myself, but pretend that I am. Then the question is, well, where does God dwell? Does God dwell somewhere out there, or is the high and holy place also within me? Right? It's part of what our prayers are designed to do is to cause us to think and to ask questions like that, to ask, where is it that God actually resides? Where is the seat of that residing? And as we reflect on that and meditate on that, it changes how we view the world. It changes the shape of the world, because it doesn't say that God dwells in the high and holy place and also with people who are named Episcopalian. It's with people who have a contrite and humble spirit. And so if we're speaking to our indigenous siblings and we note that there is a contrite and humble spirit that abides within these people, then part of our reflection on that experience is to say that God must be there too. It's a way of reshaping how we view the world. Like, the idea of prayer is what does that. The other thing I noticed, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about things that I noticed because that seems both self-indulgent and not particularly the point of what we're trying to do, but I want to mention just a couple of examples in this, because prayer expands our theology. When we pray in this way, as Blade, I think, has very, very clearly demonstrated, when we begin to pray in a way that is structured, and that we dwell with these prayers day in and day out, and we do it in community, right? That's what we read in our John Donne reading. The whole thing was about how we read the Bible together and how that shapes us and forms us. When we do that, it opens up possible avenues for interpretation and understanding that are beyond my individual self. One of the things that happens in this prayer, and I notice this with this set of prayers in particular, is almost all of them have something to do with speech. Or with our mouths, and it's a speech that does something. There's both the speech of God and the speech of ourselves. If the Lord opens our lips, then our mouth almost has no choice. Not that we don't have a choice, but we're compelled to sing God's praise. Like there's something that happens, and then there's an action. And then we might even dwell on that further. And I think about the Lord opens my lips in context of this prayer to let God kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. And so then our prayer becomes this really intimate thing. I mean, the idea of somebody opening your lips, like if you're at a grocery store and somebody walks up and they take their fingers, and they pry your lips open, right? I mean, that's assault. The idea of God doing it in a way that we welcome and becomes part of who we are. God opens our lips, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, and then I will proclaim God's praise. It's this embodied form of spirituality that fills our being. Like there's no longer language that is foreign to us. Like the idea of this intimate kiss isn't something that we do with a partner, that we do with a close friend or family member or something like that. It's something that happens with God that is embodied reality. And when we encounter those kinds of embodied moments as part of our prayer, then it allows us to take our prayer into our daily life and to take our daily life into our prayer, right? I know what it is to be kissed because, I mean, I've got 2 little girls, and every once in a while they come up and kiss me, and I've got a wife, and every once in a while she kisses me, and I've got a mother and a father, and every once in a while, like, we kiss each other, and those are all different forms of prayer. I mean, or different forms of kissing, right? We have different ways of understanding these things, and we bring them to our prayer, and our prayer informs what we do. I wanted to talk about the 1549 prayer book tonight, which is kind of gets us back on track a little bit in our sort of chronological, working through of the Anglican tradition, Anglican spirituality, and ethos. And I want to talk about this introduction a little bit, and then contextualize it with our current structure and polity, because they're related, these things. So this is written by Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer was the chief architect of the English Reformation. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury for the latter half of the reign of Henry VIII, and also for the entirety of the reign of Edward, and for part of the reign of Mary. He didn't make it all the way through Mary's reign before they decided to burn him at the stake. Thomas Cranmer was the person who presided over the break with Rome and with the creation of a specifically English church. And then, as now, the Archbishop of Canterbury held priority over the other bishops within the Church of England. Cranmer is a complex figure because he's living in a complicated time, and his theology is occasionally obscured by the political realities that he's confronted with. Biographically, he's complicated. He was married early in his life to a woman who died during childbirth. A few years after that, he was ordained as a priest. He became acquainted with the ideas of the Continental Reformers in the early 1520s. So he's on the ground floor of the Protestant Reformation. And he saw that effect firsthand in the 1530s when he developed relationships with both Swiss and German reformers. He traveled to Germany, where, among other things, he secretly married again. And he had to secretly marry again because he was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and priests weren't supposed to marry, much less the Archbishop. But he did because, why not? He was like, canonically, he was not allowed to do this, but he violated the canons, which is one of the ways that canons get changed. If enough people violate the canons, then eventually the church catches up and they change the canons. But it doesn't typically happen beforehand. Or if it does happen beforehand, then you're dealing with a very, very polite group of rebels. And they're being very kind in how they function. At the death of Archbishop William Warham in the fall of 1532, Cranmer was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. This was a political appointment that was secured by King Henry's wishes, and it was accomplished through Henry's financing of the necessary papal requirements to appoint Cranmer to the post. And so, first of all, this is really not how it's done on the continent. In continental work, the Pope wanted to be able to appoint archbishops because that was a way for the Pope to have political power in those lands. England is a bit of an outlier because the structure of its state develops earlier than some of the other places. Unified control of the land develops earlier. And so the King of England, for quite some time leading up to the Protestant Reformation in England, has a lot of agency for what happens in the church, a lot of control for what happens within the church. Both before and after his appointment as Archbishop, Thomas Cranmer was very busy figuring out how to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine and to legitimize his relationship or his marriage with Anne Boleyn. What we see with Cranmer is throughout his life is a picture of a pretty shrewd operator. It takes him, 20 some odd years to eventually get himself killed, which is not for lack of trying. He has to contend with 3 different monarchs who have vastly different views of Reformation. Henry VIII is declared a protector of Rome, a protector of the papacy, just a couple years before he breaks with Rome and establishes this prayer book. Henry VIII had sent somebody to the stake in like the 1530s, late 1520s. I can't remember the exact date of it, but he sent somebody to the stake shortly before, like a decade or so before. He sent somebody to the stake for translating the Bible into English. I didn't finish that statement before I started arguing with myself about the context of it. Sorry about that. So about a decade before, Henry VIII says, well, hey, the Bible should be read in English. He sent somebody to the stake for doing exactly that. Cranmer sits in all of these places. And there are people that he condemns and they are burned just as he is eventually burned. I mean, that's how his life is. He has to oversee the other bishops. Some of the other bishops very much want to remain loyal to the papacy, and some of the other bishops are pushing for far more radical forms. And he has to develop a vernacular liturgy in the English language in the midst of this vast social and religious upheaval that's capable of pleasing a wide audience who possesses contradictory impulses. None of this, absolutely none of this, is done perfectly. The changeability of our prayer book is demonstrated in the fact that the 1549 prayer book is followed by the 1552 one. The idea has always been to continually update it. The fact that it got stuck in a place in time for 300 and some odd years is not exactly how it was at the beginning. Okay, so part of his life is there to show us what we can do. Well, it's not there to show us that. It's the way that I'm interpreting it. But if he did it, then we can do it. If this is what happened, then it's something that we can do because it's part of our tradition. It's part of who we are. And so the first prayer book carries this introduction. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I'm going to hit some highlights along the way. It starts out, there was never anything writ of man so well devised or so sure established, which in continuance of time hath not been corrupted. So what he's saying is everything that humanity has figured out and devised has been corrupted. as it may plainly appear by the common prayers in the church, commonly called divine service. And so the idea here is this. It's not, his concern is not doctrinal. His concern is not theological. His concern is not really in the practice. His concern sits at the level of prayer. What happens when the church gathers to pray and to worship? And that's one thing that kind of sets him apart from some of the continental reformers. He's not the only person in England who's following this reform through. He's just one of the main engines of it. Okay, so this is established as a spiritual reform prior to one that is taking place at the level of doctrine or theology. And that's important because the Anglican Communion, the English Church, really, we have doctrinal understandings. We're going to talk about one in a minute, I think, if I remember to do it. We'll see how we come out on time here. But they didn't create like these grand systematic structures of doctrine and theology in the same way that like Calvin's institutes provide for the people that follow him. He goes on from there and says this: the first and original ground of this divine service, if a person would search it out by the ancient fathers, he shall find that the same was not ordained, but of a good purpose and for a great advancement of godliness. And so he's telling us something else here. The place that we want to go back to find the uncorrupted prayers is with the ancient fathers. So he's talking about people generally around like the Council of Nicaea, which is also the time, if for any of you that care about this, that it became possible to establish canon laws, because it was the time that the church became affiliated or tolerated within the state. And as that offered greater establishment for the church, the church felt that it could better conduct itself if it established laws by which it was governed. So what he's doing is he's appealing to the past original ground for the structure and content of our prayers. There's a restorationist impulse here. He wants to take something that has fallen away and been corrupted and to restore it to the fullness that it was necessary to be. And then the other thing he says is this, and there's that whole other paragraph there, and hopefully you've already read it. If you haven't, you can go back and read it. Alongside of this common prayer, what he wants to do is establish the primacy of Scripture so that it is read through by clergy and heard daily by the people, which we are still doing. If you open up your Book of Common Prayer, a third of it sits, more or less, is the apparatus that we need to pray the offices, the collects, the actual prayers, the rubrics, the forms, the lectionaries, all of that. The bulk of it are those prayers. Another third or more of it is going to be the services themselves, the ordinal, the baptismal rites, those, the funeral services, those kinds of things. So those are our prayers. Another third of it, I'm going to keep doing thirds until I get to about 5/3 or whatever. I don't know. I didn't really work out my percentages very well beforehand, so you'll have to forgive me. Another third of it is the Psalter. And then another third is the lectionaries. So I don't know how many thirds that winds up with, but more than there is in a whole. So you can say that the sum of the Book of Common Prayer is greater than the whole. The sum is greater than the parts, according to a person who is a theologian and not a mathematician. That's how the book itself is established. It's a matter of prayer, and it's designed to be a matter of daily prayer, just like what we did this past week. Every day, the genius of the Episcopal Church, and as Blade has very, very helpfully reminded us, is to ground us in this practice of prayer, because that practice of prayer shapes and forms us in very particular ways. From that ground, he goes on to complain about the current situation where this godly and decent order of the ancient fathers has been so altered, broken, and neglected by planting in uncertain stories, legends, responds, verses, vain repetitions, which Blade has also mentioned for us, commemorations and synodals, that commonly when any book of the Bible was begun, before 3 chapters are read out, all the rest is unread. He complains about the fact that this has been read in Latin to the people, and they have not understood it. Think about our resolution for indigenous liturgy in light of that statement. So they have heard with their ears only, and their heart, spirit, and mind have not been edified thereby. Oh, we're passing resolutions to correct things that are still, I mean, they're still ongoing. He's talking about this almost 500 years ago. And we're still addressing these exact issues. And then he goes on to complain about how difficult it is to find which psalm has to be read, which scripture goes with what other lectionary readings there are. When he talks about the hardness of the rules called the pie, he's talking about a calendar of readings that you have to go through to figure out what needs to be read then. And he says many times there was more business to find out what should be read than to read it when it was found out. All right. Let me see if I want to draw attention to something else here. And he talks too about the great diversity in saying and singing in churches within this realm, some following Salisbury use, some Hereford use, some the use of Bangor, some of York, and some of Lincoln. Now from henceforth, all the whole realm shall have but one use. And this is at the heart of something that Episcopalians hold dear, is the belief that you can walk into any congregation in the Episcopal Church on any given Sunday, and you will be greeted with the exact same prayers, the exact same scriptures that you would hear and pray in your congregation of origin. That's what he's trying to address. Now, there are problems with this. We're going to talk about them, and we're going to do it in relation to what we did last week at General Convention. This desire that all things shall be read and sung in the church in the English tongue. Well, that doesn't work very well. So let me see if I can share my screen and then pull up the thing that I want here. Where's this at? Excuse me. Well, shoot, where is that? Okay, let me try this a different way. And see if I can pull it up like that. There we go. It was the last box on the list of things that I can share. Okay, hopefully you're looking at my PowerPoint thing right now. Everybody good? All right, a few minutes on this and then we'll wrap up. So think about these slides then in light of what we've been talking about tonight and in light of Cranmer's introduction to the Book of Common Prayer. The first one is the resolution that we looked at the beginning. And it's this idea and this task force on indigenous liturgy. So we're going back to this issue of the liturgy must be within the English tongue. Now, of course, within the broader Anglican communion, that's not the case. In each nation, each province, the liturgy it carries forth in the way that it is that it's found there. If you're a Brazilian Anglican, then you're probably doing it in Portuguese. If you're an Indian one, then you're doing it in whatever the local language is there. That's how that works. At General Convention this year, we had translators for, I think, 3 or 4 different languages. There was Spanish, Haitian Creole, Mandarin, maybe another one that I can't remember right off, and then ASL interpreters for all of that. So the idea that the Book of Common Prayer itself could be the unifying thing, one language, one set of prayers, one service. That was Cranmer's vision, but it's no longer one that applies, certainly not to the Anglican communion as a whole, and increasingly not to the Episcopal Church, because there is more and more diversity within the church for how we worship. One of the things that we looked at was resolutions from both native Spanish-speaking delegates to convention and from the indigenous people. And they said, the resolutions were to provide untranslated material. That is, to develop material that is specific for their context, that grows out of their native language, their mother tongue. And the reason for that is because the idea of translation, translatability, is largely a myth. Like, we can translate things from one language to another and get very much the sense of it, but it's never the exact same thing. And that was made abundantly clear when native speakers would stand up in the convention to talk about a resolution in Spanish, for example, and you would hear the translation, and then you would see the native speaker go, because they knew that that person did not get it. And think about the implications of that for how they worship, for how non-native speakers worship. In the case of this particular resolution, which did pass, I think all of these passed, by the way, it's there because part of the only translation that's been done into indigenous language of the prayer book is the 1928 prayer book. And there are a lot of reasons that we got rid of that one for the 1979 one. So you have these people that are part of our church that are praying in ways that no longer reflects who we are, that no longer goes along with the sense of the larger whole. And something has to be done about that. And so part of what we're doing is we're developing different liturgies and prayers in different languages, and we're saying, this is still us. This is still us. The other thing that we did is we changed our lectionaries. So we authorized use of alternative texts for the Good Friday lectionary. The reason for that is because the text that we currently use can be read in ways that are anti-Semitic. And so we want to get ourselves away from those because they are deeply, deeply problematic texts to use in this way, decontextualized without, and it doesn't do us any good to spend half of our Good Friday sermons explaining why these are anti-Semitic, when what we should be doing is talking about the death of Jesus and the resurrection, the events that go around that. The other thing that happens here is we authorize the use of an expanded, revised common lectionary for daily readings. And so this would be for the daily office. And there were reasons for doing that. It doesn't matter to get into it here. We also did some work to change some of our lectionary readings around holy feasts and holy fasts, if you're one of the people that observes that cycle of readings. One of the people who stood up against this spoke about the fact that we have 8 authorized lectionaries for various purposes, plus unofficial ones. And a lot of these lectionaries, a lot of these texts exist outside of the Book of Common Prayer. Some of our prayers exist outside of the Book of Common Prayer. And I want to talk about that a little bit more here. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about it right in this point. If I'd been at home, I would have showed you the stack of books that I have now that contain most, but not all, of the authorized materials in the Episcopal Church. I have the Book of Common Prayer. I have 3 or 4 versions of Enriching Our Worship, which cover additional canticles, prayers, collects, funeral services, things of that nature. There is Book of Occasional Services, which, you know, is occasional services. I mean, it has to do with how we pray and certain things regarding our buildings, but also how we do parts of our Holy Week. And I mean, there's just these expansive resources. And then on top of that, we have about a half dozen hymnals. We have various other sort of officially sanctioned prayers of different sorts. And if I were to stack them up, I mean, it'd be the scale on Zoom, I don't think helps, you know, but I mean, it'd be a stack of books, probably 12 to 18 inches tall, that now comprises what we as Episcopalians think of as our prayer materials. And that doesn't even count the prayer books that I have from other countries, because I've got books from England, from New Zealand, from Canada, from all these other places that if there's something particularly useful in there, we can and have done on occasion gone to our bishop and said, we want to use this. And our bishop says, okay, which is what we have to do because that's a constitutionally mandated thing. And then the other thing that we did, and several folks have mentioned this as well, is we changed our marriage rights. We moved them from, I think, out of trial use to they're just our marriage rights now. And if they're not, they're on the path to that. Those marriage rights, by the way, they're on, a lot of these are online. They're available online. If you want them in print form, you have to get them in a book, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's, the book itself is a study on marriage within the Episcopal Church. And then the rite is part of the study. So the other thing that we did is we went into the catechism and we changed our catechism. What is holy matrimony? Holy matrimony is Christian marriage in which two people, no longer the man and the woman, enter into a lifelong union. Okay? And so what I want us to see in this is that our Constitution and canons changes how we pray, like what we do when we govern ourselves, when we go to General Convention. We change how we pray, we change the form, the structure, the content of our prayers. Our theology is changed, our doctrine is changed, and all of those fit together of one piece. It starts out in this legalistic language, and then it's something that becomes part of what we simply do. And it's important to see how all of those things really kind of wrap themselves together. You don't get to have one without the other. If we can just change our liturgy, how we pray, for example, willy-nilly without any concern for anybody else, then it's the same kind of congregationalist, like extreme congregationalist mindset that I grew up with, that what I do may not reflect anybody else in the church. Okay? If we work together, then it eventually is part of the practice and the habits of everywhere within the church. And the reasons that the bishops can let it happen sooner in some places than others is so the places that are moving ahead a little bit faster than the other people have some practice and experience doing it, and then they bring it to the rest of the church and they say, this is what we're doing and it's good. In order to codify that, there is a constitutional amendment that's being, or not really an amendment, but a change to our Constitution that's being talked about. And I believe this is the first reading of it. Article 10 of the Book of Common Prayer, our Constitution, and what our Constitution does is it defines who we are as a people in very strict and concise language. And everything else kind of flows out of that. So in 2022, the Book of Common Prayer, and this is what it says in the 1979 prayer book, I think, without any difference or change in that. I'd have to look at one of mine. If it doesn't say this, it's very much along these lines. The Book of Common Prayer, as now established or hereafter amended by the authority of this church, shall be in use in all the dioceses of this church. The Book of Common Prayer, in that understanding, is a thing. It's something that exists, and I don't have one here with me, but I'm sure everybody does. They're sitting in the backs of your pews. That's what it is. The Book of Common Prayer is this thing that you can walk over there and pick up. And what we did in this General Convention is we proposed a new text for this article of our Constitution. And this new text says this: the Book of Common Prayer is those liturgical forms, communal and devotional prayers, and other content authorized by the General Convention in accordance with this article, and shall be enriched by our church's cultural, geographic, and linguistic contexts. That is an expansive understanding of what we mean when we say the Book of Common Prayer. I don't know exactly what the I should say I can't speak exactly to how this was formed and set up, but I can speak to how it reads. Those liturgical forms now means, well, all of these things that we just talked about. Say, enriching our worship, the marriage rite that primarily is found online now, the marriage rite that's not gender heteronormative, right? Those things exist outside of the text of the Book of Common Prayer. We have communal and devotional prayers that we authorized for use that would be included in this. We have other content that the General Convention has authorized. And then on top of that, we want the people. See, I mean, this is a people-oriented thing. Like our churches, the cultural, geographic, and linguistic context can't do anything. Those are ideas. The people in those cultural, geographical, and linguistic contexts, they can do an awful, awful lot. What I want us to kind of note here is to read Cranmer's introduction to the prayer book in light of that expansive understanding of the prayer book, and to see a couple things. First of all, I mean, just somewhat in a funny way, we're just right back to where we started. If you want to figure out what scripture you have to read, you have to decide which lectionary you're using. You have to know where to go to get it. If you want to decide which prayer we're doing, you have to know that on this date, we established a day in October, I think, as Mental Health Awareness Month. There's a prayer that goes along with it. You have to know where to go and find that thing. It resides online. It's not printed anywhere. So there are a lot of respects that we're back to where we were, that Cranmer was griping about. We're back to a place where not everybody can read and understand in their language. We're back to these places where we exhibit a tremendous amount of diversity, just like they did in York and Bangor and Hereford and wherever else, right? The way that the four churches that I'm partnered with, they don't even share a common liturgy. They share a common ethos, like they've adapted the liturgy to their place and to their understanding, right? That's what we're back to. But the reason that we're back to that kind of diversity and to that kind of expansiveness is because the church itself is so diverse and expansive, and we're coming more and more to grips with what that means. And so when our indigenous brothers and sisters come and they say, we need to be able to establish ourselves and to make our own decisions, the church is finally, and 400 years too late, saying, you're right. We need that to happen. We don't just need it to happen for your sake. We need that to happen for our sake, because we are starting to recognize what we need to learn from you. How you pray, how you conceptualize God changes who we are. Someday it would be lovely in this country to have a Lord's Prayer that was written alongside of the people of Navajo land and our Anishinaabe brothers and sisters in the UP and whoever else, that reflects that kind of expansive understanding of who God is across the breadth of this, not just the white English-speaking people that really point back to 1549 and say, this is who we are and that's where we come from and there's nothing else. And I'm going to keep saying it. At the heart of what we are and what we do is this vision of collective prayer that gives us the freedom and the ability to comprehend who God is, and in that comprehension to come and understand who we are. It's what we started with in our prayers in Isaiah. There's the God who is high and lifted up, and then there is the God who resides in the humble and contrite place, which is me. That's what all of this stuff is about. And if it's not about that, it's not any good. I'm going to stop there because we're 10 minutes over. I apologize for that. Are there any other comments or reflections before we close for tonight?
So did that article that you just described, that amendment, did that pass? Is that
Yes.
now the law of the land?
It did pass, but it is not yet the law of the land, because in order to change our constitution, I think Wendeth was the one who was talking about this. It has to show up at 2 different conventions and be
Okay.
approved at both of them. And
So
that
the book,
prevents, kind of spur of the moment thinking from becoming something that really resides at a deep level. We have
so
to
the Book of Common Prayer is no longer a book.
That's kind of what I've been thinking all week. The Book of Common Prayer is an idea, and we're working on codifying that in our constitutions, in our language that defines who we are.
It hasn't been for some time, especially in this diocese.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the other thing I've also been talking about, right? Is changes to our constitution, changes to our canons are always going to take place at the local level before, not always, but but are very often going to take place at that local level, because there's a diocese like Northern Michigan, or other expansive dioceses that allow this to happen in certain places. And then once it happens in enough places, then it changes for everybody.
Good stuff. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other thoughts and reflections from anyone before we close?
Well, thank you for putting all this together.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a whole lot of material to go through to even
Yeah.
figure out how to present it. So thank you.
Well, and thank you folks for doing this in a little bit more conversational way tonight. I've really wanted to do that from the beginning, and I feel like it worked a little bit better tonight than it has some other nights, so it wasn't quite as lecture heavy. So I'm grateful. We are meeting, I think, the next 2 weeks, July 10th and July 17th, and then I think we're taking a break, and it's just kind of a janky summer schedule when things work to fit around everything. So I will see you next Wednesday. Note that change, next Wednesday at 6:30.
Yep.
Eastern time.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you,
Very
folks.
good. Thank you, Brad.
Thanks.
Right.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.
Yep.